Hi, this is Jenny. Thank you so much for watching my YouTube series, The Uneducation or My Uneducation. I have been looking through and dissecting the MPD150 report, looking at the history of the Minneapolis Police Department. We are now up to the present and what's currently happening today. And there's a lot. So let's dig in, shall we? So as we looked at the history, we see many incidences of police brutality. So what should be done to reduce police brutality? The typical responses from so many politicians, conservatives say, add more police. Liberals might say, reform the system, reduce the amount of things that they're allowed to do. We're going to eliminate chokeholds, which ironically the Minneapolis Police Department just did in response to George Floyd's death, and do other things. But neither of these responses actually address police terror at its roots, nor do they address the systematic economic, social, and racial injustice that commonly bring marginalized people into contact with the police department. My favorite claim is that there are just a few bad apples in the system that are making the entire police force look poorly. In case you wonder if that's true or not, the president of the police union, Bob Kroll, here in Minneapolis, already had 17 complaints of excessive force against him when he ran for president of the police union. He was voted in with 80% of other police officers voting yes for him. So if you want to ask if there are a few bad apples, right now that answer is 80% bad apples. In 1967, there were 300 police officers who were policing a city of about 300,000 people in Minneapolis. That is one officer for every 1,000 people. Today, there are 892 police officers who are patrolling a city of 425,000 people. There are also 117 civilians, FYI, who also work for the police in various capacities. I'm assuming administrative roles, payroll, back office, all other kinds of areas. If we only count the officers and not the civilians who are on the police force, that's basically one officer for every 477 citizens in the city of Minneapolis. We must be a really unruly bunch that we need all those cops here to make sure we don't do things that are wrong. So in my neighborhood of Fulton, the cops only patrol here from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. I know this because the Lake Harriet Community School upper campus gets out at 4:10 p.m. And we had a lot of issues once upon a time with traffic control around there of parents stopping in the middle of the street to either pick up or drop off their child. And it was really kind of a mess. Some of my friends who live right across from the school asked the police to get involved, asked them to please help with some traffic control for the students' safety. Their response was, we only patrol your neighborhood from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. And because school gets out at 4:10, we're not there. And it would cost more money to have cops working overtime or working in your area to help make that happen. So there was no police response to that. Instead, what they did was they worked with the school. The school sent out many communications to the parents, reminding them of the proper procedure to drop off their students. And they had teachers who willingly gave up some of their time to stay after school and stand out and patrol and make sure it happened safely. But going back to this policing from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., you would think, my goodness, I live in the city of Minneapolis. My neighborhood must be chaos after 3 o'clock, right? I mean, there must be murders happening all the time, people getting mugged. Crime must be awful because, the cops aren't here for the majority of the day and night, right? That is actually the opposite. I live in one of the safest neighborhoods in Minneapolis. Why would that be? I mean, if cops make us safer, shouldn't we have cops here all the time to help make us safe? Well, as I heard one speaker say after George Floyd's death, neighborhoods that have resources do not have crime. Homeownership in my neighborhood is at 85%. The median household income, $136,000. If you want comparison, the median household income for the city of Minneapolis is $63,600. People who live in my neighborhood do not struggle to put food on the table. They don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make their rent or their mortgage payments. They have access to good health care, health insurance that makes that payments happen, transportation, well-paying jobs, and great schools for their kids. My neighborhood is also 92% white. The public school that my kids attended all the way through 8th grade, 88% white. Now I want to reiterate this. The success of the people living in my neighborhood is not a factor of our race, but of our circumstances and our white privilege. As I mentioned previously in looking at the history of the Minneapolis Police Department, my neighborhood was considered favorable for lending by the Homeowners Lending Company or Corporation in the 1930s. Covenants were placed on my home and others around me, saying that people of color could not buy in this neighborhood. So here we are, a century after those policies were built. My neighborhood still looks like it did back in the 1920s, and really nothing has changed. Now let's look at zip code 55407. That is the zip code of Cup Foods. That is the grocery store where George Floyd was murdered. The median household income of that zip code is $53,735. That's below the median for the city of Minneapolis and 60% lower than my zip code. Only 40% of the people living in that neighborhood own their homes, 60% rent. 12% of people living there who are over the age of 65 do not have health insurance. And 20% of the people living in that zip code, or in that neighborhood rather, make less than the federal poverty income level of $26,200 per family, or for a family of four, I should say. Both of those numbers, the number of people who don't have health insurance and the poverty level, those numbers were so negligible in my neighborhood that they aren't even reportable. When I look at the median household income of my neighborhood, 66% of people living in my neighborhood make more than $100,000 a year. The disparity of wealth is staggering. And even though that neighborhood, Powderhorn Park neighborhood, is 4 miles closer to downtown Minneapolis than mine, bus routes were drawn in such a way in the 1960s that they had to take 2 transfers and 3 buses to get to the good-paying jobs in downtown Minneapolis. You can see the skyline from that neighborhood. You can't see the skyline from my neighborhood, and yet then, as still now, I only needed to take 1 transfer and 2 buses to get from my neighborhood to downtown Minneapolis. So there was inequity built in our system, in our entire city, from the get-go, and slowly by slowly, we are unraveling all of these inequities. In the 1990s, a fabulous, wonderful activist group brought the disparity of the transportation system to light, and the Metro Transit system responded and redrew its transit routes to create equity and ensure that those who need public transportation and rely on it have the best access. The system wasn't created with equity in mind, but the people demanded change, and change happened. We are at the precipice again right now. A study by the University of Cincinnati showed that the U.S. police forces are increasingly being militarized. Between 2006 and 2014, the Dept of Defense transferred $1.6 billion with a B, dollars worth of equipment to local police forces. This equipment included mine-resistant tanks, assault rifles, bayonets, airplanes, and camouflage equipment. Jack Murritter, assistant professor of poli-sci at University of Cincinnati, wrote this about the findings. You often use the tools that you have, regardless of whether it is useful or correct. When you're given a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Arthur Reiser, who is a former police officer and soldier, and now a policing expert at the R Institute, wrote, "We've created this world where we're not just militarizing the police, we equipped the police like soldiers, we train the police like soldiers. Then why are we surprised when they act like soldiers? The mission of the police is to protect and serve, but the premise of the soldier is to engage the enemy in close combat and destroy them. When you blur those lines together, it's an absolute breakdown of civil society." The University of Cincinnati also completed a study analyzing the number of police against crime rates from 1968 to 2013. When they did that, they're basically looking at the number I showed before of 1 policeman for every however many thousands of citizens or hundreds of citizens. And then also looked at the crime rates of various cities across the United States against that ratio of cops to people. This data showed that increasing the number of police does not reduce crime. And when police numbers are reduced, crime does not increase. One of the researchers stated, we can reduce police staffing and use that money to renovate our neighborhoods and our communities. I think that's better than just increasing the police force. Merwitter said that this study has been replicated by academics, and so far, the findings have held every time. So one of the laws that has been on the books since 1898, two of these laws, spitting and lurking. Now the lurking ordinance read this way. It says, no person in any public or private place shall lurk, lie in wait, or be concealed with intent to commit any crime or unlawful act. Now this is different than the city's rules on loitering. People who reported lurking tended to be white, 69%, while those who were reported on as lurking were mostly black, 60%. I went to a march yesterday here in my neighborhood, and it was mostly white people attending because, again, it is a mostly white neighborhood. However, we did hear from some black people who've either lived here, grew up here, know the area, moved away, moved back, that kind of thing. One young man spoke of growing up in Linden Hills area, moving away, going off to college, and relatively recently he has bought himself a home. One day he was standing in his front yard and all of a sudden the cops just drove up, and he's thinking, what is going on? His next door neighbor had reported him. His next door neighbor had called 911 and said, there's a black man standing in the front yard of this house. What is he up to? I would wish that perhaps would say, well, is he breaking any laws? You mean he's just standing there? In 2015, the activist group Neighborhoods Organizing for Change, which is based in Minneapolis' north side, advocated removing spitting and lurking from Minneapolis laws, ordinances. They did eventually do that in 2015, and I think the final vote was 12-1. I am glad that those laws are now abolished and no longer a part of Minneapolis City Code. Lastly, I reiterate to you the case of Justine Damon. She is a white woman who lives in my neighborhood who was killed by a black cop. She called 911 because she heard sounds in the alley behind her house of what she thought was a sexual assault. She had to call the cops twice because no one showed up after her first call. And again, as I reiterated, the cops do not patrol my neighborhood after 3 p.m. When the cops did finally show up, she was the one who ended up dead. So a couple of quotes here from the MPD150 report. The idea of a police-free future is neither naive nor unrealistic. It is the only pragmatic solution to the challenge of a police system rooted in the era of slavery and Indian removal, which has defeated every reform effort thrown at it. To believe that we are just one or two reforms away from turning the police into a trusted partner of the very communities it has treated like enemies to be conquered, now that is the ultimate in magical thinking. And lastly, it is time for us to face reality. If we want to build a city where every community can thrive, it will have to be a city without the Minneapolis Police Department. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being open to new ideas and educating yourself, or rather uneducating yourself as I am uneducating myself. Next up will be what a police-free community would look like. Thank you.